So we can do questions if we have questions. I did it in 45 minutes. I'm happy. Yes.
You intrigued me with your comment about New Mexico. You understand the basic situation there.
Yeah.
The state is severely divided between whites, Euro-Americans, different kinds of Native Americans, Navajo, various Pueblo, Mexicans, and Hispanics. And that in northern New Mexico, there are communities which refuse to identify as Latino. They insist on Hispanic, that they are all descendants of the conquistadors. And in fact, I know a census taker who's remarked upon this. They could get additional federal monies were they to identify as Latinos, but they refuse. So it can be quite complicated.
Yeah, the effort is not to impose, not to tell people that they really are Latino, right? Or that that's the identity that they should embrace, or Mexican. I mean, what's really fascinating regionally is the way that, for example, even categories like Mexican American are more embraced in situations, say, closer to the border than they are in a situation like Chicago, where most of the folks I worked with identified as Mexican, not Mexican American, not U.S. Mexican. They call themselves Mexican regardless of whether they had never been to Mexico proper. So you could be born and raised in Chicago. So there are really complex ways that people end up identifying, and what's important is trying to figure out what's motivating those modes of identification. I mean, I joke, my father's Puerto Rican, my mother's Canadian. It's complicated, but many of my family on my father's side would claim to be Portuguese, for example. They fictively imagine themselves to be the descendants of Portuguese people. They knew nothing about Portugal, but it was more desirable to identify as Portuguese than as Puerto Rican from their perspective. And so, you know, what is it that's informing, what kinds of imaginaries are informing these modes of identification? This is what I'm trying to make sense of. In Holyoke, I mean, what's so fascinating is you have, again, the highest concentration of Puerto Ricans in the United States. You have strong modes of identification with Puerto Ricanness on one level, but on other levels, many of the community members who I've interacted with in my preliminary work, they've said, I don't know anything about Puerto Rico, I guess I'm Puerto Rican, this kind of thing, when in fact, they have grown up essentially in Puerto Rico in Holyoke. In many ways, from many perspectives, based on the practices in which they engage. Speaking highly vernacular forms of Puerto Rican Spanish, specifically, which is part of what's most fascinating to me there. Yes?
It's funny how this thing about Americanism, being an American or not being an American. Personally, I'm originally from Chile, and I am an American because my country basically is an American. So from where comes this misleading use and expropriation of the word America? Because the reality, the first map where this word it's labeled on is in the Library of the Congress, which was in it's all over the area from Colombia, which is not even closer to here. So this expropriation of terms that also is sort of an expropriation of identity.
Which is what's so interesting about this kind of image that I started with but didn't talk about, of course, by Pedro Lash, the artist, was essentially calling into question this notion that the U.S. has a claim on Americanness that's separate from Latin America. And I mean, I think that moving forward, part of the discussion that we need to have, for example, around immigration, I mean, the U.S. has very carefully created economic policies that allow for the free flow of goods across borders. So that right now, material items, commodities have more migration rights than human beings. So what would a citizenship of the Americas look like that actually reflected the fundamental Americanness across the U.S. and Latin America and Canada as well? So why could we imagine a transnational citizenship or a supranational citizenship in the EU that we can't imagine here? I mean, we know why. But that's something moving forward that I think we need to have a conversation with. The free flow of goods should be met with the free flow of people. Will be met with the free flow of the people. The question is, how will they be monitored, surveilled, detained, deported, etc.? So I think this question about the Americas is absolutely where we need to be. Yeah, Anthony.
How else, like, I know you brought up some titles of, like, newspapers and things like that, this whole idea of, like, this imagined future informing our decisions about today, like, in what other ways is that kind of, like, produced, I guess? So I'm trying to, like, picture it in my head besides, like, media and things like that, but can you speak to that?
Sure. Well, part of what you have to think about is the ways that any imagined past is linked to an imagined future, invokes an idea of the future that we should be. So that all of the narratives that we've talked about in our classes around, the U.S. as this specific kind of open territory for the taking frames the U.S. in the future as belonging to a particular population legitimately. So the U.S. status as a settler colony is erased by this claim to a particular past, so that these futures are invoked every single time that we learn about U.S. history, for example. It invokes the idea of who has a legitimate claim in the present and ongoing in the future. So popular media are just one institutional site. Yes?
In Holyoke, you said it's preliminary.
It's preliminary. I feel bad, I like to show voices and this kind of actual people. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, but I don't have those data yet, so that's starting in the spring.
Okay.
I'm working with students.
In a school, or you are in the school?
I'm working with the Paulo Freire Social Justice Charter School, or high school. So I'm co-teaching a class with a teacher there, and my university students here will be co-learners with high school students there, and they will be trained as sociolinguistic ethnographers to document their language practices within the school and in the community, and essentially to remap Holyoke on their own terms, so that language isn't understood to be a disability to overcome, but a resource to be developed, is the idea, and that UMass students or the professor are not the knowledge holders about the community, but that we are in solidarity with trying to figure out how to reimagine and remap this context.
And I don't know, I'm not very familiar with the population in Holyoke, but if you come across other languages, students that speak other languages besides Spanish, will you be mapping those as
Absolutely.
well?
The idea would be to think about repertoires. So what do communicative repertoires look like in different contexts? So across modalities, so not just spoken language. You always talk about language speakers as opposed to language users. So what are the ranges of ways that languages are used throughout contexts in Holyoke? Yes?
I think a sign of the future is if you drive on Route 9 past the Chinese immersion school, you will see construction behind. They plan to go from K to 12.
But it's so fascinating. So, even there was a column that was published in Anthropology News a few years ago. Every subgroup in the American Anthropological Association has its monthly column. And so the Society for Linguistic Anthropology's monthly column was titled, "Are We Teaching Too Much Spanish?" And essentially it was framed as an argument for teaching more Chinese specifically, and of course Mandarin Chinese, rather than teaching Spanish. And so there's this way in which bilingualism or multilingualism in terms of particular languages, and not even just particular languages, but particular varieties of particular languages are framed as valuable resources, so that we would rather imagine learning Chinese in the U.S. context, and again, specifically Mandarin, than we would learning Spanish, much less Caribbean Spanish, which run for the hills if you're a Caribbean Spanish speaker, is the idea. So this notion of the future being associated with particular languages and not others, and again, for whom, for which populations, is that kind of multilingualism framed as a resource versus a handicap? Yeah.
So I see tons of points of contact of the work that you're doing in documenting toward policy in so many ways. Are you active in some levels of policy informing? It could be economic, it could be educational, it could be language learning, it could be in so many directions.
Yeah, I think of myself as an inadvertent bumbling activist in some ways. So I theorized my way into activism in some sense. So I have worked on language policies around bilingual education. Multilingual education is one of the main things. So I work with the Language and Social Justice Committee of the American Anthropological Association. I've been the chair of that committee before. And we worked on language use around immigration and notions of illegality in popular media. So it's not just language as an object of, say, racialized discourse. So that is whether people should speak what language where, but also language as the medium of racialized discourse. So in what ways is language used to frame populations as illegal or as deserving of disparity or, again, detention, deportation, etc. So I'm working on some of these issues, but I feel as though that's what I'm least equipped to do in some ways, because I just feel like any policy, once it gets instituted, watch out. You will learn very quickly how bureaucracy works and how co-optation works. That's my sense. And even the question, even so, for example, in the debate around illegality, one of the biggest problems that I found when I would discuss this with reporters was the question for them, which is, okay, so what should we call them? If we don't call them illegal, undocumented people, if we don't call them illegal, then what do we call them? Which for me meant that I hadn't communicated the point, which is we don't need a new label for a stigmatized population. We need to rework our policies that stigmatize people. So there's no such thing as an illegal person is not a good answer for them. And it was very, very difficult for me to say, we need to create a new immigration policy and reimagine migration as a fundamental human right, not come up with a new label for people. That wasn't a pleasing answer. So these are the difficulties when you enter those realms. Yes?
How do you collect your information in the schools and the curriculum? Do you have focus groups?
Well, in some of the classrooms where I work, the difficulty with schools is you often have to go where they'll let you go or where you get sent. So in schools in Chicago where I worked, I was working as part of a program that's called AVID, Advancement Via Individual Determination, a terrible neoliberal program. So in AVID classes, all the students were packed together in the same, there wasn't tracking, allegedly there wasn't tracking in the school where I was working, but there wasn't a subject area. AVID was a study hall, essentially, where you would work on all of your different coursework. In this classroom in Holyoke, where I'll be working in the spring, it's with English language arts. Although I've tried to persuade the teacher that the cool thing about linguistic anthropology is that you can be a natural scientist, a social scientist, and a humanist simultaneously. That's what I tell myself. I'm working with a language arts teacher, because the idea is that we're designing experiments, we're looking at poetics, and we're analyzing interactions. So I think we're covering everything on some level. That's, again, my case, although that's for the National Science Foundation on this, for this audience. So a language arts class in the spring. Anything else? Yes?
Can you say a little bit more about how you conceptualize the connection between imagining a past and imagining a future? What is the connection between the two?
Well, the point, again, and present has to be in there, or it's a multiplicity of pasts, presents, and futures. I mean, the thing with Latinos, of course, we have to recognize that on some level, the Latino population has skyrocketed in the last 30 years. That's there's no question around that. And yet, this population has always been here on some level. So it's the newness that's associated with Latinos that's a concern for me, and the ways that I think that newness invokes a past in which Latinos weren't present. So that we imagine in the United States, or we erase Spanishness, the Spanish language in the United States, so that if you're a young person growing up who was born and raised in the United States, you don't know that Montana is montaña. You don't know that Colorado is Colorado. That these are Spanish words that are built into the fabric of toponyms. Toponimo, I know you teach toponyms, and Gloria teaches those in her heritage class, right? But these place names are really powerful signs of the ways that this language and this population has inhabited this nation. So that the Spanish language is always imagined as a foreign language. So that past and that future for me, or the imagining that past, is a way of opening up a future in which people haven't yet arrived. Their time to be represented, their time to state claims to rights and resources is not yet here. So we only ever see demographic prognostications or projections. It's only in 2050 or 2070 or 2100 that Latinos will be here. So then what do people do today? Because there are 50 million of us, or more, really, when you look at undocumented people. So what happens today?
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.